Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's edition of You're Leaving Again. My name is Laura, your USO host, as Trish said, and I am thrilled to introduce Corie and Matt Weathers talking to us today about one of the most important topics to any relationship, which is communication. We all want to know how we can communicate better with our spouse, and especially those of us who might be physically apart from our spouse, and maybe the serving spouse is far apart from their family, trying to navigate through how to have some of those good conversations and also some of the tougher conversations. And I know Corie and Matt are going to give us some great pieces of advice and talk us through kind of what their experience has been in their current deployment and some previous deployments, and just how we can all communicate better. So I'm thrilled today to introduce Corie and Matt. We have an hour for the actual session, and then we're going to tack on about 30 minutes afterwards for some Q&A. We had a lot of great questions come through the registration, so we'll get to as many of those as we can. Without further ado, I'd love to bring Corie and Matt up on camera. Hello, both of you. Thank you for being with us today. And
Hello.
I'll hop in the chat box, so I'll see you all later.
Thank you, Laura. So excited to spend some time with all of you guys. My name is Corie. I don't know where he is on your screen, but he's on mine. There's Matt, and we are currently going through our own deployment right now. So he's currently deployed, and I'm back at home with the kids, and we're just honored to partner with the USO and share a little bit of our story as it progresses month to month, and also do these webinars in a way that are topical, hopefully topics that will really resonate with you and hopefully encourage you. And so this month we wanted to do the topic on communication. Matt, you've been gone are we on month 4, 5? 4, I think so. And so I think that that's like a perfect time for us to start talking about communication, right? Because I think, if you go back and listen to the other parts of this series, you're going to see that we've kind of walked through like what it's like before you go, and then ripping the Band-Aid. And then over the holidays, we talked about like, how do you build your relationship through the holidays, any kind of holiday, really. We touched on parenting. Last month, we touched on intimacy, which is a big factor when couples are apart. And so communication, especially by month 5, no matter what you kind of set out as far as your intentions of staying connected and trying to communicate well, by month 4 or 5, communication and trying to figure out how to do that well definitely is a real topic. And so we're going to share a little bit about what our experience has been like trying to communicate. If you've been following us this whole time, we kind of set out with some goals. We've been using a tool along the way to kind of communicate. We're going to share a little bit about that. But then we're also going to address the actual topic of healthy communication. And so as a counselor that works with military and first responder couples, and Matt as a chaplain, which I'll let you do your disclosure here in just a minute, so we don't forget to do that. Communication is like one of the biggest topics. When I ask couples, what's bringing you in for counseling, or what do you want to work on? Communication is usually like the top answer. But I don't know if people or couples often know, like, what is it about the communication that we need to adjust? I think most often we're talking about connection and how do we connect better. And that's definitely true in a separation, what we call a military initiated separation. So even if you are not separated from your spouse right now, this is going to totally apply to you, because communication in general and doing that in a healthy way is so important. But especially when you're apart, it's really hard. So Matt, I'll let you introduce yourself. And I know you do like a little disclosure thing, so I'll let you do that.
I've got it written out. So hi, my name's Chaplain Matthew Weathers. The views expressed are those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Department of the Army, Department of Defense, or the United States government.
There you go. Like, you get more formal with each webinar.
Well, actually, I have to give a shout out to the friend. You sent me the opinion piece from a friend of ours, and he included it at the bottom. And I was like, I'm going to read that tonight. That's going to be good.
It's a good way to cover things.
I try and just do this massive covering of all of it, but I figured I could actually use the actual lingo.
Always smart to fall within regulations where you can. Well, we are just welcoming all of you. Please use the chat. We are going to take your questions and also address some of the questions that you turned in at registration. They're great questions. We'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. So definitely in the chat, feel free to participate as we're talking. We love interaction. And then, of course, there's also that Q&A box if it's a little bit more specific and you want to make sure that we see it. And then, of course, Laura and Trish will be managing that as well. So I think, Matt, what we should do to start off today is, we've been trying to be really authentic in our story. There's not a whole lot of content out there for couples going through deployment on what is it really like to go through deployment? And the whole purpose of this is to validate other couples that go through what is probably normal in a deployment, including struggling to communicate. And so I can definitely provide an update, but I thought maybe to start off with, what have you learned in the last month? What have you kind of been going through since the last time we did the last webinar? What would be your update?
One thing that came to mind before I actually do the update is just in case nobody has ever most people haven't sat through one of our, gotta put my fidget spinner down. I gotta put that down. Sorry. Nobody haven't gone through a marriage retreat with us. So to introduce Corie and I as communicators, I am a deep-seated extrovert and my wife is an introvert. I have to talk out a lot of things and she does a lot of stuff inside of her head and then sometimes forgets that she does it so intensely that she forgets she hasn't actually said that to people. And so just want to let you know if there's, I think in most married couples, you have one person or the other that tends to be more extroverted or introverted. And so that does shape how we communicate and how we approach communication and our theories on it and the different ways that we struggle in our communication. So the update since the last time, since February, oh my gosh, Groundhog Day happens and you're like, what month is it? It's like the Gandalf, Lord of the Rings. I have no memory of this place. So what's been updated? Well, honestly, if we're going to be vulnerable and honest, so I've been over here watching my wife go through a Central Texas storm that was devastating to a lot of people and luckily not to my family, but also watching both of our boys, our 14 and 17-year-old, or 13 and 17, 13 and 16.
They're still 13 and 16. You haven't been gone that long.
14 and, yeah. So 13 and 16 get COVID. And which was devastating for us because our son has asthma. Luckily, they're on the other side of it. It just came across as bad colds, but it was hard for us because we've kept him in virtual school up until one of them started to fail a class and the other one started to fail at life and relationships in general. And so we both made the decision right after Christmas, hey, send the boys back. And then since last time, both of them got COVID within 2 weeks of getting back to school. And we made it through it. But I've been over here powerless, watching her struggle with things at home, which, as a service member, you beat yourself up over kind of what the job takes you away and what it takes from you. And then the tax and the toll that your family has to pay on the other end. So that's really kind of what we've been going through, what I've been struggling with. Luckily, things have kind of evened out now. It's been a month of feeling very powerless from this place, but we have made it through. And I'm incredibly proud of how you did that.
It wasn't smooth. And can I just be authentic with that? It wasn't exactly smooth. And he's being very generous. Before the ice storm of Texas, if you guys saw on the news, we had I know it sounds crazy for Texas to just get snow and for it to be devastating, but it really genuinely, we've lived in Colorado and it was, you could go ice skating outside our backyard. And so it was pretty significant. And I feel so grateful coming out of that we did not lose power and water. There was a lot of people that really were burning furniture to stay warm. And you can't leave your house to go anywhere else. You're just kind of stuck in your home. But he's being generous. The week before all of that, somewhere in there, I also had a breast cancer scare that I'm going to share only because we're talking about communication. And I think we kind of hit what a lot of couples probably go through when there's even something like that happens. and how that impacts your communication, because it was a really interesting thing to go through in that, I'm not saying this was the right thing to do. And I can say that I learned something about communication from this process, but at the time I was really, just kind of, I'm introverted. And so I was thinking that applies to what we're talking about today, as far as how you process information impacts how you communicate information. And so for me, I didn't want him to feel powerless. I didn't want him to be more scared than we needed to be. And I thought we needed more information. And once I have information that was worth sharing, then I would share that with him. And so I kept that information. And I'll be honest, I actually kept that initial mammogram kind of diagnosis, whatever, to myself, because I had the example of other military spouses who had been through it before, who had also made the choice to hold off and not share it with their spouse until they had more information. And so I thought, you know what, that feels okay. It doesn't feel right, but it feels okay until I had more information. And I didn't want him to feel that powerless. And so I kind of kept that from him, and honestly kept it from a lot of people. And I should not have. I learned that lesson in all this, that I should not have. And, I eventually, I remember I had a biopsy scheduled, and I remember I had this thought one morning that I was like, you know what, all he needs to do is check my calendar and he'll see that I have a biopsy scheduled, and then we'll have a conversation. And in that moment, if I was actually in my heart trying to hide something from him, I think that I would have taken that off right then. There was a part of me that really wanted him to know. And you can honestly unpack that on so many levels on what that means for couples. But I'm sharing this with you because it's an interesting dynamic that we have as spouses back at home, where you try your best to be very protective of how you communicate, how much you communicate, and either we kind of lean towards one area where we overshare, which I definitely do. In fact, I think we've figured out every Saturday I just dump everything in his lap, and then I'm usually in tears by then, and then he's like, "Hope you feel better." That's not a great approach either. Or we hold back too much. And that was a good example of that as well. And so I had this breast cancer scare. Everything turned out fine. But then right on the end of that, coming out of exhaustion with that's when we had the ice storm, and then the boys having COVID in the middle of that. And it was a very intense month, and a lot of communication and trying to figure out how to navigate through this. And Matt, I'll let you respond to this, but I mean, there was part of me that throughout this last month, I really didn't feel like I was necessarily falling apart. Although I'm sure it looked like it at times, but I didn't feel like I was falling apart. But it definitely was at a limit of whether or not I can do much more or handle much more stress than I was already handling. And so there was a part of me that was like, I don't want him to feel like I can't do this or that I'm falling apart here. But I also need to share with him, this is really hard. And I don't, I want to communicate, this is really stressful. And I want him to be present with me in that. But it was really hard for me. I'm seeing a lot of other people going, yes, I've been there. And so I'm wondering, for some of you that are listening, especially if you're a spouse, because I think Matt can share from the serving spouse perspective, that there's a part of you that's like, I want to share, but I'm either I'm going from one spectrum of extreme of oversharing to not sharing at all. And how do I land in the middle and be authentic without looking like I'm completely falling apart, when I feel like I kind of just need to let it out and then I'm good again. So wondering if everybody else is kind of feeling the same. So Matt, I mean, I know you were not happy with me for good reason for not sharing that with you. And I would love for you to share with everybody what you told me when we had that first phone call, about how that impacted you for me to not share that with you. And also, what do you remember what you said to me about who we are? You're giving me big eyes. He's like, I don't remember. Speaking of communication. Well, I'll tell you what he said. First of all,
I'm a futurist. Remember, I'm forward thinking. All right.
Well, but this was really important to me, and that's why I remember it more than you saying it. But the first thing you said to me was, of course, I'm glad that you're okay. But number two is we don't do this. We don't do this alone. We don't do this life alone. And so whatever you're going through, I need to know what you're going through, because you don't get to go through things like that by yourself. And I loved that. I needed it. It was hard to hear because I knew that I didn't do the right thing. If I could go back and go again, or if I could talk to my friends, I mean, I definitely talked to a few of them afterwards and said, and they understood, just like you guys are saying, yeah, I get it. They understood. But as soon as he said that, like, you don't get to keep those things from me. Secrets are not good. And I agreed with that completely. But more than that, like you're not supposed to go through that kind of level of stress or frustration or fear by yourself. And if I could go back, it's definitely not something that I would want to do alone again.
Yeah. So, I mean, part of it, there were a couple things. Number one was the ability to encourage you through it. Now, I know that, I mean, the different things that we've had that have happened during deployment, totaling the car, things breaking down, things falling apart, health scares, kids being unruly. I know that 110%, you're having to face that and usually face that alone, whether it's just a time zone difference or an inability for me to be able to weigh in or assist with a decision. And so sometimes I just want to, not sometimes, all the time, I want to be able to come alongside you and just really cheer you on, because I actually want to see, I love watching you grow as a human. I love watching you become more decisive. As service members, we get, I'll speak for a lot of them, especially leaders, we get decision fatigue. We are hit with so much information that we have to make a decision about. So really there's the preface of it and this applies deployment and when we're both in the same physical location of prefacing something with, I don't need you to make a decision about it. I don't need you to weigh it, maybe talk it through with me. But I know I've got to own this and I'm going to own this. Or, just listen. I just want you to hear how I had to process it. I want you to hear what it meant to me and how it felt. So when you have that little tagline, just as much as I have a tagline of whenever I do one of these events, that these are all my own views, if you have a little tagline that leads with, okay, so everything's good. I don't need you to make a decision on this. I already have a way ahead, or I just want you to hear me out. I know it may be tough to hear how I'm processing this, but I don't blame you. I'm not shaming you. I'm not resentful. This is just where I'm at. This is what I'm dealing with life. If you give that little disclosure, that little disclaimer at the beginning, and then you begin to go into what you're unpacking, it allows me to not feel like I have to make a decision. And because of our faith standpoint, it allows me to pray for you. It allows me to encourage you and come alongside you. It allows me to be even more thoughtful in the way that I relate to you. Because if I don't know what's going on with you, chances are more than likely I'm going to be kind of obtuse or unfeeling, or I could come across as very uncaring. And so if you don't share information with me and then you get resentful because I'm not being caring, is it my fault?
Right. It's a great point. And I'm going to respond to what Nicole said here in just a minute. It's so true. And here's what's interesting is that, sometimes we don't say anything and we're kind of overly protecting our spouse that does not need protection. Now, I will say, I've talked with Matt and I've talked with other service members, and they've said, like, if you are struggling and you're not, I call it building a house there, like building a house in your suffering, building a house and living in that place of unhealthy coping, then that is going to make your service member feel completely powerless and completely like, I don't know how to help you if you can't use the resources around you to help yourself, right? Mm-hmm. So there is an element of them feeling powerless. But aside from that, I just want to say I think it's really ironic that sometimes we don't share information because we make an assumption of how they're going to respond to that information. And so in this case, I made the assumption that between the two of us, you would spiral into fear more than me. And so I made that assumption to protect you from, like, I guess, yourself. And what's amazing, all of you guys, is that he actually did not respond that way at all. In fact, his response was actually caring and calculated in the best way and vision casting and there for me. And I would have missed out on that if I just made the assumption that he was going to, respond in a certain way. So I think part of the message today in healthy communication is, number one, owning your own communication, number one. And number two, this is so hard to do, even after 22 years of marriage, we can say, number two is trying not to manage the other person's communication for them or manage their feelings. And me protecting him from himself was honestly me managing him, and he didn't need me to manage him. He gets to manage himself, right? And if he were to come back in a way that was maybe unhealthy, then that's my role in this relationship and as his friend, and this is vice versa, for me to then bring that to him and say, okay, what I really need from you right now is such and such, right? I have to then own my own communication back. So I do want to respond to what Nicole said, because I think it's a really important, great point. We actually went through our first deployment with Nicole. And so I'm trying to pull up your comment here, Nicole. She said, my scare was during a combat deployment. It's definitely different than his last Korea deployment, and it's hard to distinguish after being through a combat deployment, in my opinion. And so, Nicole, I'm going to try to speak for you, because we were there. I was there with you as a spouse through that combat deployment. Matt was with your husband during that combat deployment, or at least one of them, the one that stands out to us. And so,
no, let me make a note. The way you said that, it makes it sound like at least one of her husbands. She's only had one husband.
No, yeah, thank you. No, I didn't mean that. No, but it was a significant deployment with a lot of scary situations. We lost a lot of really amazing soldiers. And so I think, Nicole, what you're saying, which I think is really important, is that sometimes when you've been through a deployment that is intense, that is extreme, where there really is a lot of dangerous things happening, when you really do need your service member to have their mind on the mission and not on the things that are happening at home. And so you really do, in those kind of situations, be really protective of what you're sharing. And so I can imagine that after and can I say, Nicole, that your husband was shot in the knee, I believe, during that deployment. And so he did come home injured, right? That's significant. That's a big deal. And so after going through something like that, I would bet that it kind of confuses your, how do I share? When do I share? And some things that don't feel like a big deal because you've been through something that's a very big deal, right? So these other things may not feel like it's a huge deal. So maybe it's not worthy of sharing, or maybe this is not, just doesn't compare to that experience that you had, and that can complicate communication too. And so that's what I'm reading. Please comment if you're hearing something different or wanted to say something different. Go ahead, Matt.
So one thing I also wanted to say for service members, especially during that time, and those deployments are still happening and going on, that service members also, and you definitely hit the nail on the head in your book, is that we each have those sacred spaces of those places where you're like, what do I share and when do I share and how do I share it? It happens on both sides of the ponds of, what information and when. Probably one of my biggest regrets is not taking more time during those first few deployments to actually document what I was experiencing, what I was thinking, and what I was feeling. We kept a really good email track back and forth, and called as much as possible to be able to process that. And that helped light years towards our reintegration, which was still very rocky. Mm-hmm. So what I would tell people right now is, like, do not wait. If you're not processing or communicating over phone, over video, over email, over chat, and you're not sending that information real time, and you don't feel like you can, document that information so that when your significant other comes home, then you can be able to go, okay, now you're home, now we're safe, now we're good. Here's my journey. Like, here's the log of what I've just gone through. Like, if you want the code for who I am right now, how I've changed over the past few months, this is it. This is what I was thinking and what I was feeling. And so if you're not keeping them up to date real time, then when you get into reintegration, it's going to be almost impossible to try and figure out who the new person standing in front of me actually is. And so for communication, it's not just simply about, like, how do we avoid arguments? It's literally about, like, lean in, like, how do I be more intentional so that you can understand my internal world, so that when you encounter me next, then you know. Yeah.
It's Steve.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Yeah. No, he did. Good. So I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to cry. So I'll call him later. Anyhow, that's good. I mean, keeping that journal in a rack, keeping those times where, because then you can lean back on it. And then I know that all of us, you know, that have young kids, at some point in time, you want to be able to explain who you are and how you changed. And this is who I was before, and this is what made me different. And to give them that context, it's crucial, not just for leaving a legacy, but for helping them understand your heart and your mind. So I think the intentionality in communication is key.
So I think that's so important, and I'm so glad we're talking about this today, because communication can be just so impacted when you guys are spending time apart. And if you're making those conscious choices to communicate or not communicate, I think the question always needs to be, no, how do I communicate and communicate this well? Couple of things before I get, because we're not going to have a ton of time to go through some very important material that I think will be really helpful to you. A couple of the other things that have stood out to us over the last month: time zones have definitely played a part in interrupting our communication, or what our normal communication would be. I know that sounds obvious, but it's been a real struggle for me on my side. You know, we've been sharing this amazing journal. We've shared at each webinar where we're using the Day One journal app, where we just log into the same account. And, you know, while I'm sleeping, he is journaling what's going on in his day, what's going on in his mind. And then the next day, usually while he's asleep, I'm kind of journaling something. And so each day we kind of wake up to the other person's journal prompt. And that's been really wonderful. And I'll be honest, it was a little hard for me at first to like do it every single day. There was times I was like, what are we going to talk about? But I will also say, I'm so glad I pushed through on the other side of that. And I know Matt has shared on here and with me several times as an extrovert, how valuable doing journaling has been for him. There were times that I kind of beat myself up because with all of that I was going through, my journal entries were just like subpar compared to his. Like his were so thoughtful and his were so like concentrated, and mine, I felt like I was like, sometimes honestly, I was like passing out asleep as I'm writing, you know. And so it was really a struggle for me, and I really accidentally locked myself in unnecessarily to that time zone issue, because I felt like if I wrote in the morning, well, he's up during the day, I should just call him and have the conversation instead of writing. And so I would hold off writing until the evening when I was too tired to write. And he even shared with me, you shared with me yesterday, Matt, like, I would much rather you write when you feel like you are fresh and able to use your mind to think clearly, and then repeat that information in a phone call, you know, than get locked into like how the time zone makes a difference. But I just felt like I was going to repeat information. And so what's the point? And so I'm really trying to work my way out of that and try to have a little bit more intentionality of when I write, that it doesn't matter what time of day and whether or not he gets it early or whatever, that it's more, because I mean, this is something that, oh man, I meant to, it's downstairs, to show you the book that you ordered. That of the day we actually ordered, Matt shared in a previous webinar that he compiled all of our previous emails into this journal app, and that you can print off a book version at the end. And so he actually, for Valentine's Day, printed off. And so I have a book downstairs of all of our emails from that first deployment. So it was really, really cool. And I wanted to show it to you this time, so I won't be able to show it to you this time, but it's really worth it. And so that's been good.
If I start talking, you can run downstairs.
I can. How about you do that really quick? Go.
Well, okay. So a couple things on the communication. The content. Okay. So when we were talking about journaling and we're talking about talking on the video, it's always key to understand what's the best mode of communication for the content of communication that you're trying to put out there. So for instance, I know that if there's more difficult topics for Corie and I to discuss, and that as an introvert, she needs a little bit more time to be able to process it, rather than to be able to confront, not confront, but rather to be able to talk about it with her on video chat or on the phone. It's easier if I give her that information ahead of time and allow her to process it and think it through. And then when she's processing it and thinking it through, then I know that I'll receive a more thoughtful response. versus if we're just sitting here bantering back and forth, talking about the boys, talking about what's going on in her life. That's very low threat. It's very low key. And the other part of it is taking time to thoughtfully journal or thoughtfully email in your communication allows you to be able to process it out loud, read it back before your significant other reads it, and then decide, okay, well, maybe I actually just worked that issue out just by kind of blurting that out on the page, and actually don't need to send it. It's kind of like those mad emails that you end up never sending. You're just able to process it out, and then you go, okay, you know, was that going to bring me closer to my significant other, or was it going to take me away? And if it's going to take me away from that, I really need to decide, is this something that I need to talk about, number one, at all? And number two, is it something to talk about like right now? So
here's quickly what the book looks like. So he was able to choose the cover. Obviously, this was a deployment to Afghanistan. It's a great hardcover book. It's really awesome, guys. But like you can see, like these are some of our emails. He was able to put in like photos. This is like our welcome home at the end of the book. And so he actually put in the photos that go with that time of that deployment. But it really is an amazing, and we're not making any money off this day one app. This is just a tool that we're using. And so we wanted to test like what if we're going to talk about using it. But it's really beautiful. And I think since it's hardcover, we'll be able to do that for this deployment too, which is super fun.
yeah.
Okay. So a couple of things I see people saying, somebody else mentioned there's they have a 13-hour time difference. It really does impact. And I think we need to be okay and be honest about that sometimes and share with each other how that impacts your communication is super helpful. So, okay, here's what, if you're okay with it, Matt, I think we can get into a little bit of what does healthy communication look like? Because again, I know we get this topic all the time, which is healthy communication. And I think in order for us to talk about what healthy communication is, we have to talk about what does unhealthy communication look like, so that we can recognize when we need to make the switch, right? So you have you should have gotten a PDF, like a listening guide that came with your registration. If you want to pull that up afterwards, you can. I am going to screen share just one page of it here in just a minute, so you have a visual. But I'm not going to read through all of it, but there's a couple things that I want to point out that I think is really important as far as some myths about communication that a lot of people believe in marriage. And so just really quick, a couple of the myths to think about is that a healthy marriage with good communication does not mean that they're conflict free. Okay. Friction is actually what makes a car go. The tires having friction with the pavement moves you forward, right? So conflict isn't necessarily bad, but if it's unhealthy communication in conflict, that is where it can become destructive. But if you have healthy communication in that conflict, it's actually a powerful tool that leads to growth, that leads to forgiveness, that leads to empathy and understanding and awareness of what's going on in both worlds and how to bring that together. It's very, very important. And conflict is going to happen, especially in our military couple world, when we are living literally two totally different lives. And I had a session this morning where we were talking about even when you're at home, you're still having two very different experiences of the military. Unless you're a dual service couple, you're really having two totally different perspectives of the military and how the military feels to you, right? And so anytime you're communicating that, it's going to be ripe for miscommunication. Another couple of things, not every healthy marriage that you see out there that has great communication started off that way. Okay. I would say most couples, including us, we're still growing. We're still trying to figure it out, but we share openly that the first few years of our marriage were very, very difficult. And we really struggled in those first beginning years, a lot because of expectations, a lot because we had poor communication. But it's really about how do you continue to grow and get better over time, and what are you learning? I love the fact that Steve and Nicole were talking about how they use marriage books. We recommend all the time finding a book or a tool that you can do together, whether it's a journal, whether it's reading a book together, so that you have that conversation and have something to talk about. Will always get you growing. Did you want to say something?
So an encouragement. Yeah, just if you've never been able to we've never been able to kind of be vulnerable and honest. with you, like the way we are at kind of our marriage retreats. Growing up at what do you think? 3, 4, it's about 5 years. You would say 5 years, first 5 years of our marriage were incredibly difficult. So you say 5, I say 4, but 5. We'll say on 5. And a lot of that was just because we didn't know how to figure out marriage, didn't know what to do. And so in encouragement, just take a minute. The thing that changed our marriage dynamic, and Corie, this goes back to you talking about wanting to manage me and to manage my emotions and my feelings. And you finally just said, you know what, you're going to have to own that. And I can't own that for you. And I can't make those changes internally that I wish you would make. And so you took ownership of yourself in terms of keeping your side of the street clean and taking care of yourself. And that changes the dynamic. I mean, it's just like any system. Once you changed, I was given really only 3 options within the system. And that was to change with you. That was to work really hard to make you change back, or that was to leave. And for you and I, leaving was never an option. And I began to see that you actually seemed happier that you had made changes, and I kind of like, that was enticing to see somebody that had more joy and more peace in their life. And that's what pulled me towards wanting to make those changes. And then once I got started making the changes, I started sprinting through the changes because I was like, wow, this feels really good. It's like eating healthy. This feels really good. I think I'm going to keep doing this. And then you had to start running faster, metaphorically, to be able to catch up too. And so it's not simply about directing energy towards the other person to try and force them to change. Direct the energy and really focus on yourself about being your best self and managing yourself, and it will change the dynamic. So that's really what the turning point was for us, as far as being able to figure out our communication, understanding that you're an introvert and I'm an extrovert, and the way that I need to be able to process information for me to tell you, and this goes into the communication thing, for me to tell you, hey, the first thing out of my mouth isn't the most true thing, but it's the start that I'm going to have to start making to get on the journey to find out like exactly how I feel about this or what I'm actually thinking about. That's the way that an extrovert works. So if I don't get all those minutes that I need to kind of verbally, express everything before I'm like, this is how I feel, this is what I think. It's not what I said initially. It's what it is now. Now this is how I think. Once I get to there, then I'm like, oh, but I also have to realize and be protective over what I say, because I don't want to do damage along the way on that journey. So that I, at the end of that journey, feel like, wow, I was able to express all this stuff. I feel great. Only to have you be sitting there going, yeah, but can we deal with the third sentence? Because the third sentence sounded like crap.
Right, exactly. Okay, so there's a couple of things that you said I want to respond to. Number one, he talked about the importance of boundaries, and we won't be able to go into this very deep today, but boundaries in marriage are crucial. A lot of times we think that, we're supposed to share all things, and we are, like, we live under a house together, but that doesn't mean there's no boundaries within the house, right? And so having healthy boundaries between what do I own versus, what's my responsibility versus what's his responsibility, and being able to communicate those boundaries in a kind way. We're going to give you some tools on how to do that. But boundaries need to be in your relationship. It's how we communicate them. And what I find for couples is that yes, I mean, it's kind of difficult for couples to realize that boundaries need to be there. But what's even harder for couples is drawing the line. But I will tell you what's even harder for couples, where they really get stuck, is the disappointment if your spouse doesn't respect those boundaries, and now you have to kind of have some level of consequences, or at least express your feelings and your thoughts about the fact that they didn't honor those boundaries, and how do I communicate and enforce that boundary line? That is where couples really struggle, because in our minds, we just can't comprehend why somebody that we love so much wouldn't honor and respect boundaries. And so that's where people really get stuck. So boundaries is super important. he also mentioned how we kind of got to that point where I kind of set some boundaries with him, and really it was just out of a place of I don't know what else to do other than just take care of my own mental health, and then you get to decide whether or not you take care of yours, and I will either continue to grow and you won't, or we're going to grow together. But that's the only thing I knew how to do at the time. And so by me kind of moving forward like this, then nobody likes to be left behind in marriage. Like we all want to grow together. And so what that does is it encouraged him to grow alongside and kind of catch up with me. But then what happened is he kind of started to outgrow me, and that makes me feel insecure. And he also held me accountable on some things that I needed to change. And suddenly I was faced with the same situation of I either need to grow and respect what he's asking me to change, that is a healthy request, or he's going to outgrow me. Right. And so there is this dynamic in marriage that we kind of sometimes grow like this. Sometimes we grow together by reading a book together, using a tool together, and we're learning the same things at the same time. But there's often times where we're kind of like going through life ebbing and flowing this way, and that can be healthy too. So, you also mentioned something, Matt, about we've mentioned several times about introverts versus extroverts. Again, we could do a whole webinar on just that. But he was describing what that's like for the extrovert and needing to be able to process that out loud all the way through. And that first draft that comes out is usually where the introvert gets stuck, because we usually keep all of that information in our head. And then when we finally figure out what we want to say, then we say it. So it's really confusing to us when the extrovert starts off and says something that's so jumbled and maybe it feels destructive or it was something hard to hear, but that was just their first draft. They're trying to get their way to their final draft, but we get stuck as introverts on that first initial draft and we stop listening, right? So that's by the time they get to their final draft, they're like, this is what I really mean. This is what I'm trying to say. By the time they get there, we're like, I haven't heard anything that you said because I'm so hurt by the first draft that you said, right? So again, this is why we started journaling, because we found journaling helps both introverts and extroverts find their words at the same time. I'm trying to keep up with some of your comments. Let's see.
You know, for an extrovert, that's why journaling is really important, simply because you can process it without doing the damage. The other part about the boundaries that's so key is that, being able to communicate what those boundaries are, not just throwing the boundary up and then the other person trying to guess what they are, but to be able to say, hey, this is where I'm at. This is who I am now. The decisions that I'm making for myself. And to be able to own that and just say, I'm making it for myself. I'm making it for my own sanity, for my own well-being. And owning that is helpful. So
yeah, and I'm gonna
intently.
Oh, I'm reading the comments. Sorry.
Okay.
I can,
Yeah.
I think, what Nicole said in her, I'm assuming I'm going back and forth between who's Steve and who's Nicole. I think they're both in the same account typing. So you guys may have to let us know who's who, but being able to, I think it's Steve, just to try to understand, but the statement, the quote that they gave is a good example I'm going to come back to when we get to healthy communication. And, so don't forget there is a Q&A box for your questions, because in about 15 minutes, we're going to transition to question and answer. You don't have to stick around for the question and answer time, but we have found over the course of this series that an hour of us kind of talking and then transitioning into question and answer gives people who are maybe not on a lunch break that can afford that extra 30 minutes. It's a great time to dive a little bit deeper. And so here's what we're going to do. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to screen share this one page from the listening guide that we made for you that shows what is unhealthy communication. And what I'd like for you to do, those of you who are listening that are watching right now, as we talk through the various forms of unhealthy communication, I'd love for you to self-identify, not necessarily talk about your spouse, but see if you can identify which way you lean in your unhealthy communication moments. Okay. So we're not diming out our spouse, right? We are just talking about, this is what I tend to do when I'm maybe not at my healthiest. Okay. So it's really important to be able to know what is unhealthy communication. Matt, can you see that? Okay.
Got it.
Okay. So unhealthy communication, you probably have heard of these before, but we're going to actually get to here in a second what is assertive communication. But very few people actually talk about and teach assertive communication. We just kind of maybe passively learn this unhealthy form of communication, and then we go into marriage doing the best that we can. But assertive is where we want to go. But first, let's talk about the other three. And I think we can do this quickly because a lot of you have heard of this before. But you have on this spectrum passive, passive aggressive, and aggressive communication. And all three of those are unhealthy versions of communication. So passive, Matt, I'll let you kind of come in on passive aggressive, and I'll cover passive. That's not for a specific reason. Just
You're stupid like your father.
That's from Dane Cook. If you've not heard Vicious Circle, a lot of bad words in it. Listen to the clean TV version. Okay. Passive is really when you have thoughts, feelings, opinions that you want to share, but you're afraid to share them and you just don't. And so maybe you're apologetic, overly apologetic. You keep them inside, you repress them inside, and then you probably walk around your home wondering why nobody understands you, because to you might be communicating them, or you're waiting for someone else to ask you what you feel before you feel that, or before you communicate them. And so it may be because you've come from a background or you're currently in a relationship where you don't feel like you have the space or the right to share it. Maybe you've been run over a lot in communication, and so you just kind of hold it to yourself. But again, if we're going to talk about taking responsibility for your own personal communication, if you lean towards passivity, it's really about deciding this is not healthy for me. I've got to learn how to communicate openly what I'm feeling and take ownership of that. Now, I'm going to just throw this out here. This would be a very interesting conversation for you to circle up some military couples and have a conversation about this. But one of the things I'm seeing within the spouse culture, just let me talk about the spouse culture, is that over time, as we have to constantly adapt and move and relocate, and the military kind of tells us what we're going to do and where we're going to go, over time, I've found that spouses habitually start leaning towards passivity. And even if you kind of came in as an assertive, maybe even as an aggressive kind of personality, that after a while, you kind of get to a place where you're so used to not being able to feel like you have a voice or a choice, you just stop sharing it. And unfortunately, the spouse community kind of does this. We kind of can become aggressive to each other. And so a spouse, can say, maybe a more senior spouse they don't mean to, but when we start saying things like pull up your big girl panties and get over it, like that phrase, that's an aggressive phrase of, whatever you're feeling, stuff it inside, don't share it, and drive on, right? That's an aggressive form of kind of stepping on someone else's rights to have and express their feelings and thoughts and telling them to keep it inside. And then I'll share a little bit about passive aggressive, and then Matt, you can go from there. Passive aggressive is kind of the, you still hold it inside, but externally in your behavior, you're doing things that are hinting that you have feelings, hinting that there's something under the surface, all the while hoping that the other person is going to notice it and ask. So maybe you're stomping around the house, you're slamming doors, you're, shrugging, you're just not really communicating, all with the hope that your spouse is going to go, oh my gosh, like, are you okay? Is something wrong? And then as soon as they ask, then you unload, right? When really owning your feelings and being able to express it, that we can do that without making them guess. So Matt, if you can respond to those two if you want to, or go from there, what are your thoughts?
I was going to go ahead and hit up aggressive,
yeah,
just for the sake of time. So just initially, my thoughts on aggressive is you have to be able to diagnose when you're dealing with an aggressive communicator. It usually falls, I think, in three areas. They are either a cruel person, and they're just cruel by nature, and that they get joy and pleasure out of hurting another person. They're dealing with a deep-seated insecurity in themselves, and the only way that they can overcome that insecurity is to try and hurt other people, or to be demeaning or to be demanding in their communication. And those aren't mutually exclusive, or they're feeling threatened. They're not cruel, they're not insecure, but they're feeling threatened. And so they're coming across and they're communicating in a very aggressive way. Now, I know that when Corie and I were struggling in our communication, and whenever we have a really good argument, it's usually I'm the pursuer, but I don't really know what I'm trying to work out. I just know that we're trying to work it out. We're trying to work through it. And so where Corie's trying to process her feelings, her thoughts about whatever it is that we're talking about, I'm trying to get resolution because I want to have connection. And so what comes across as aggressive is really me trying to pursue her through communication, but really doing so in an immature and in an absent-minded and thoughtless and sometimes can be hurtful manner. And so being able to diagnose, is this person just being cruel? Is that what they just enjoy doing? Is that why they're communicating aggressively? Are they dealing with some level of insecurity, and they're trying to try and place themselves in a different position through their communication? Are they defending because they feel threatened, or are they pursuing? And so it may take a while to be able to try and, I don't want to say diagnose, but determine where that aggression in the communication is actually coming from. But I tend to think that it happens more so with individuals that are extroverted, or it tends to happen with people that have been passive for far too long.
Yeah.
And then once that passivity has been far too long, all of a sudden, all that rage and anger and resentment builds up and festers. And then all of a sudden there's that explosion, which comes across like a complete shock, because the person that's been encountering the passive communicator for a very long time has never expected that any of that was underneath the surface at all. And that really kind of goes into the defending and feeling threatened. Whenever you have that threat response, it's really amazing what our amygdala will do to us and make us how we will act in order to be able to shove away the perceived threat. So any thoughts on that, Corie?
Yeah, no, and I was looking at this spectrum and I thought to myself, this is really, I could see myself over the past month, on this spectrum, right? Like when I was not sharing with him what was going on, that was a passive form of communication that wasn't healthy. Like I'm holding inside, I'm not sharing for whatever reason out of insecurity, or we talked about that already as far as the reasons why I didn't share what was going on. Passive aggressive might be me, hoping he's going to ask if I had a hard day instead of me just saying that I had a hard day, or me being snarky. I don't think I did this, but like if there's kind of hints that I'm dropping, which is really unfair to do to your spouse if they're a distance away, right? When you have fewer senses to, all of our five senses, when we talk about communication, your five senses, I can tell you, the more of your five senses you can use to communicate, the less there's going to be miscommunication, right? So that's why video chats, and that's why we're doing this over video, because you can see us, you can hear us, we're engaging as many of the senses as we can when we're apart. So, that's why Matt a second ago goes like, you have this, strong look on your face. Well, I'm just reading the comments, right? So you get these nonverbal cues. And so the more of your five senses that you're using when you're communicating, the less room there is for miscommunication. And so if I'm just not really communicating my words to him and hoping he's going to pick up on it, well, we're already missing out on things like physical touch, the ability to hug and calm each other's bodies down. That's a form of communication. Like all of those other things we normally would have in person, of course, there's going to be even more room for miscommunication. And so, of course, I do see, we can definitely lean towards the aggressive side when we're apart if we're kind of bottling all that up, or if we're kind of unleashing our resentment out on the other person when they're powerless to control the situation. If we're just being aggressive, character assassination, calling each other names, shouting at each other, telling them that you don't want to hear what they have to say, all of that is an aggressive form of communication. So really quickly before we wrap up with this hour and go into question and answer, assertive communication is where we want to be. This is what's healthy, okay? Healthy is, I'll never forget this, when I was working with women out of prison and we were teaching relapse prevention. It was the first time I had to teach this similar material. And I remember reading the statement, I kind of memorized it and just kind of took it with me, where assertiveness is you have a right to your thoughts, your feelings, and your opinions. You also have a right to ask another person to change their behavior if it's destructive to you. As a human being, you have those rights. In other words, meaning when you're feeling something, that's valid. It is a valid
Mhm.
emotion, and you shouldn't and can't talk someone else out of those feelings as if they don't matter or they're wrong, right? If they feel a certain way, it's very real to them and it's valid, okay? If you feel alone, that's valid. Go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, differentiate real quick feeling and thought. You can have a valid feeling that's tied to an irrational thought. So can
Yes.
you unpack that?
Well, yes, and I think it's through our communication, assertively communicating, that we start discovering what's rational and irrational, right? That's why it's a dialogue. It's a communication
Hmm.
back and forth. And so when we say assertive communication, you have a right to express those thoughts, feelings, and opinions. That doesn't mean that those thoughts, feelings, and opinions that they may not change over the course of the
Hmm.
conversation, right? But when we are first feeling a certain way, it is okay. I'm speaking maybe to those that are on the passive side, right? Sometimes you've got to be able to say, I have this feeling and it's very real and I need to be able to say it to you. I just need to tell you what's going on within me. And then it becomes that dialogue. But aggressiveness would be to say, that's not right. That's not real. That's not what you really meant. Like that would be
Yeah,
aggressive.
aggressive is actually trying to force the other person into feeling or thinking exactly what you are feeling or thinking.
Yes.
Um, and then passive is I'm willing to think or feel whatever anybody else is. I'm just trying to go along to get along.
Yes.
Where you're desiring harmony above autonomy or the ability to express yourself as an individual. You said something, and I read it on the second bullet on the right side, is the being able to change your mind, is
Yeah.
being flexible enough to grow together. And if we expect our significant other to grow and change and be able to change their mind, we have to do that as well. So
Mhm.
if there is something that I'm expecting Corie to grow on, then I need to be able to grow on it as well. Because I'm not trying to just create, a little, clay person as I mold them. I'm trying to experience the dynamic part of life that is going to make me scared at times. It's going to make me afraid. It's going to make me, it's going to challenge me. But you can't like selectively numb, like Brene Brown would say, you can't selectively numb. You can't avoid all those bad things and then expect to have all the good things. And so you've got to be able to, you know, excitement comes from unknown adventures, from where you're like, ooh, this is new, this is different. I don't know where we're going to PCS. All right. Now there's some bad stuff about PCSing. There's also some good stuff. Maybe there's a Panera nearby. Maybe there's even better bagels. So
Well, and I know some of you may have to drop off the call here if you need to at the hour mark. That's totally fine. We're going to go into question and answer where I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into this assertive communication and give you some better examples of what it looks like to set healthy boundaries, to ask for change in your relationship, what it looks like to own your own feelings, what it's like to receive your spouse's thoughts, feelings, and opinions, and how to take that in assertively and not become passive or aggressive. And so we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that assertive communication. So stick around if it's something that you can listen to. If you can't stick around, just know that this will be recorded and on the dashboard where you can find all of the videos that we've done to this point. The audio version of this is also available on my Life Giver podcast and will be out soon. So you can listen to it as well. And so we're going to get into some of these questions here in a second. The key, I'm going to transition now into our question and answer for those of you who are sticking around. The key to this assertive communication, really when it comes down to it, is that you have the right to express your thoughts, feelings, and opinions, but you want to do so in kindness. And what I mean by that is without violating the rights of the other person, right? If we violate the rights of the other person to their thoughts, feelings, and opinions, that's where we are becoming aggressive, right? So Matt, you look confused there for a second.
you just got really loud for a second.
I did. I'm so sorry. I don't know why.
It's okay. You're back normal now.
Better.
I
That's
was
better
like,
than
whoa, aggressive communication.
Well, that's better than if I would have said something like really wrong. I was emphasizing. You're right, Laura. I don't know why that happened. Okay, so because you kind of made that face right when I said violating the rights of other people, and I'm like, I don't mean like in an inappropriate way.
We are violating the rights of other people.
So, in other words, guys, like, how do I? Like, let me see if I can go back to when Matt and I were struggling early on in our marriage. when I started to set those boundaries, I was doing my best. I didn't know that I was trying to practice assertiveness at the time, but what I was attempting to do was own my own feelings and go, this communication that we're doing, that we are living through, is not okay to me. This is not feeling healthy to me. And so I'm going to communicate that I want something different, that it needs to change, and that I'm uncomfortable with it staying like this. That was me being assertive, to own how I felt, express what I thought, and ask for change. And it doesn't work, because believe me, I tried to do it in unhealthy ways of screaming that, of not saying it at all, and trying to be passive, or, just to give him the cold shoulder after an argument. And none of that was effective. And so really kind of it came to a point where I just said, I'm just going to own how I feel and put it out there. But I'm also going to hold the boundary and say, if we are going to grow closer together and we're going to heal this, something's going to have to change. And I'm allowed to say that. I'm allowed to express that. But if I can say it in a way that doesn't shame him, that doesn't character assassinate him, that doesn't run over his rights. And Matt, one of the things that you kept saying to me over and over again back then was, I have a right to be upset. I have a right to my feelings. And that was so true. Like, I think I was like, don't be so angry, right? Don't be so mad, because his expression of anger and frustration was louder than my expression as an introvert of anger. And we had to learn how those expressions come out and then how to both do that in healthy ways. But I remember you saying all the time, I have a right to be upset at something that is upsetting. And I had to keep going back to that and going, actually, that's true. He does have a right to his feelings. He has a right to express them. We just have to figure out as a couple, how do I ask you to express them and let you own them and have them, but express them in a way that I can also hear and meet in the middle somehow.
And I think one of the hard parts, especially early on in marriage, and if you don't get it fixed, it just continues all the way through marriage, is the expectation that any of us know how to do this well just to begin with. So we talk, all with people and have relationships all the way up to marriage, but we don't ever really get trained on it. We don't ever really have feedback mechanisms. Literally, our feedback mechanism for learning how to communicate in school is whether or not somebody continues to hang around us or we develop a group of friends. But then that even becomes this little very insular group that just affirms whatever your communication style and skills actually are. And so you begin to think, I must be able to communicate well. Why? Because these other people hang around me. Well, they may not be able to communicate well either. And so you just may be all this self-reinforcing group. And then you get married and you're like, I know what this is. I know how to do this. I've watched movies. I watched my parents. I'm either going to mimic what they did or do the exact opposite. And I'm going to get this right because I know what marriage is. And it's like getting in a car, having never understood how a car works or functions, but you've seen them drive. And so you think you got it pretty good. And then you get on the highway and you're just trying to keep up to speed. Well, the first day for a kid on the highway trying to get up to speed, you're going to be so anxious and you're going to be white knuckling it. Within a couple of miles, your level of frustration, anxiety, and fear is going to be so high. And that happens for all of us. So the number one thing I will say is that if you're having problems with communication, you need a mediator. You need somebody that can give you outside advice and guidance that this is going well or this isn't going well. And the beauty of whatever's happened in the last year with COVID is that telebehavioral health has become a big thing. And so if you have the opportunity to engage a telebehavioral health provider, that your spouse is in the States and the other person is deployed, and they can do that with within the parameters of their state licensure, you can have like 3 people in different places sitting there working through communication and have somebody mediating for you. Because there's what we think we say and how we think and feel we're coming across, but oftentimes in our head, we're like, this is going to be brilliant. This is going to be phenomenal. When I let this go, this is going to be the best thing in the world. And then you say it and you're like, it's like taking a puzzle and just throwing it out on the table. And you're like, that doesn't look like the picture on the box.
I think that might be just you.
Yeah. So
no, it is true. It is true. So thank you for that. That's an important caveat as we go into these questions. it's so hard to know what's happening in your world, what's happening behind these questions. There's so many variables behind why people communicate the way that they do. And so it's almost impossible for us to answer some of these questions without having more information. And so what we're going to do in answering these questions is kind of apply it to the material, almost like a hypothetical question, kind of making up some of those details. So if we address one of your questions, just know, we know that we're probably getting it wrong. And there's a whole lot more to the story than is in this question, but we wanted to tie it back to the material today and kind of answer it through that lens. Okay. So, and some of these will go through faster than others. We're going to, Matt, let's try to move through them quickly because we tend to get stuck like on one or two questions and kind of camp out there. And so we're going to try to go through these faster. Definitely go to the Q&A box if you have something in particular you want us to address, and we'll do the best we can. Question number 1 is, why is it easier for me to share my life decision, or I guess how I make life decisions, or the decisions I'm trying to make, big decisions, with my spouse, but it's harder for him to give me the same courtesy? So that's a big question, and there's a lot of variables that could be behind that. I'll kind of take this one as far as, here's the thing. I think regardless of how your spouse responds, especially if you're making big decisions or trying to navigate how to make big decisions, it's always important to share those life decisions and how you're trying to make them with your spouse. And if it's harder for them to share that, it could be because they're an introvert and they're just not sharing all the details of all the thoughts that they're having to try to make that decision. And maybe they get to the end and then tell you what they decided. That could be something that's going on. But even just being able to go up to your spouse and assertively say, I call it turning the lights on in the relationship with our communication. Like, you can hear behind the question, there's already disconnect in the couple, right? Like, I want my spouse to communicate and they're not so much. And so I feel disconnected. And so I say, turn the lights on with our words, right? Where we can say, I love you. I really want to know what's going on in your inner world. When you don't share it with me, I feel disconnected. That's an honest statement, owning your own feelings, not saying that they're doing something that's horrifically wrong, but it is being able to say, this feels destructive to our relationship, and I'm kindly asking you to do something different, or at least tell me what's going on that keeps you from sharing it. A lot of times I find for most couples, it's really a difference of personality and how we kind of interpret information. I can't tell you how many couples it comes down to introvert and extrovert, really. Okay, Matt, why don't you do this next one? How do you keep relationships strong with your kids through absence? So it's like communicating with kids.
Right. So there are actually several ways that you can do this. And we have all the tools. We have so many more tools now than we used to. The fact that when Corie and I got married, that our first computer had a 1 gigabyte hard drive, and we were like, this is amazing. Who would ever need an entire gigabyte on a hard drive, right? And when I was compiling the book for Corie, I was even able to go back and look and see the videos that I'd made with the boys. So this comes down to age, and it comes down to what needs to be communicated. And so if you've got young children and you're just trying to be a face and a voice on a screen, then that's very easy to do, and to be able to send those things home and to be able to mail them home and to plan things out. We mentioned this when we were talking about parenting, 2 hours of creating little videos of, reading chapters of a book, putting that into the hands of your supporting spouse back home, and then being able to have that for the kids goes a very long way to being able to feed that need for that level of communication. We have teen boys, and based out of that, they have phones and they can text. And so the ability to just be able to send texts maybe throughout the day whenever our time zones are overlapping, to be able to just consistently say, I love you, I miss you, I'm thinking about you, here's what was going on in my life, here's what I was processing. And this communication is important and consistent. It doesn't have to be big buckets. It could be consistent small drips over time that is a constant reinforcing for your relationship with your children, that I'm thinking about you, that I miss you, and to be able to articulate that. Before I left, I gave both the boys like leather-bound journals, and I'm almost positive they have not written one thing in those things, right? But exactly. So
But it still taught them the value of this is a way of communicating that I think will stand out to them. And I think it's still worth that you gave that gift to them.
Yeah. So I would also say this, go back and listen to the one that we had on parenting, because we answered a lot of good stuff about how to stay connected with kids while you're deployed.
So we have another question in the question answer box where it talks about my spouse isn't the best at reciprocating general questions about my life when I'm asking about his. What's a good way to communicate with this with him effectively so he's more aware of the issue? And they're saying he's a caring person. He just isn't like thinking to ask those questions. Honestly, I think that again, I'm going to say this a million times about turning the lights on, because that's what assertiveness is. Assertiveness is like not being passive anymore. And we're actually going to say the thing that is like, it's the elephant in the room. It's the thing that's between you and your spouse. It's the thing that's keeping you distant. So we've got to have the courage to say these things out loud. It's just how we do it, right? So even just you actually wrote that beautifully. Whoever wrote that, you actually wrote it really well. It's actually being able to go to your spouse and say, hey, I noticed that when I'm kind of sharing, I'm asking you how you're doing, you typically don't ask me how I'm doing. And that really feeds me. And it really makes me feel seen for you to ask me kind of similar questions back. You can ask why, but honestly, I would say sometimes it's a matter of upbringing. It's a matter of what you grew up with and what you saw in communication. And sometimes just using a communication tool like the check-in, we gave that, I think, back in, I can't remember which month we did that, but we did. The check-in is a 5-minute, 4-question check-in that you can do every single time you connect with your spouse. It's what are you physically feeling right now? What's been on your mind? What are your emotions right now? And then what do you need? And just being able to answer those 4 questions and take turns with those 4 questions. You ask all 4, or you answer all 4, and then the other person goes. I think you'll be surprised how much you get from that conversation and connect in that just 5 minutes. That gives you a lot of the connection that you feel like you need. So bringing in a tool like the couples communication cards, the check-in, coming up with prompts and questions that are prepared in advance so that you're not doing the same questions every single time. Bring in tools. If somebody is struggling and it's a weakness of communication, bring in tools instead of just expecting them to just figure it out or be a natural at it. Go ahead, Matt.
I think in relationships, there's always one person that pursues more than the other person. And so there's a difference in the level of pursuit. One person just may feel more comfortable without there being that much forward pursuit, and the other one doesn't. And but there's also different levels according to how we pursue one another. So just because we often give what we expect to get, okay? And if we're not getting, then we will give even more as a way to kind of drop hints. So I'm going to give this more, and I'm really trying to drop a hint that you'll actually like catch on. This is how you love me. And somebody mentioned the 5 love languages. I think you can break that onto even many more. But if you're wondering, like, why don't they do X, Y, and Z? Well, that's not how they're built. I mean, that's how you're built. So you're expressing the love language that you want to have from the other person. And then going back to assertive communication, it's almost like, this is how to love me. This is the best way to love me. And I remember you and I actually have little black books on that,
They're out of print now. We're going to have to make them, I think.
Yeah.
But it was like a whole book of fill in the blank of how to love me. And you're just answering all these questions and then you swap them, which is fantastic. Thank you, Laura, for putting the 5-minute check-in. I'm going to, hold on one second. I'm going to read another question here.
Such a silence.
It's I know. Just so quiet. Get across to him. Okay, so this question actually comes up a lot when I travel and speak with, especially spouses, but working with couples. It's the question of, as from a spouse perspective, when you're kind of holding all of the responsibilities and the weight of the world's kind of on your shoulders, and you're kind of keeping it all inside, and then your spouse comes home and you kind of get to a place where you put yourself so much on the back burner that you eventually explode. That would be going from passive to aggressive, right? Like we didn't have healthy assertive communication leading up to it, especially I can hear this just happening during reintegration, right? Like I've been holding it all inside. I really need your help. I need you to jump in and take responsibility. And during reintegration, what not usually happens, but what I hear from a lot of couples especially with rapid tempos, is that you're holding it all inside and you're waiting for your turn. Supporting spouse at home, service member comes home and they're needing to readjust with jet lag. And then that might sometimes, we're talking about dysfunctional behavior here, rolls into video games or not being fully present and engaged in the home. And then if you've put yourself on the back burner, passive aggressively waiting for that person to jump in and take responsibility and know what you're feeling, then you are going to explode, right? And so I actually had a spouse, one talk that I gave. She was in the back of the room and she was talking about being on the back burner as if like, if you're cooking dinner, she said, when you think about it, and she was trying to make a really good point, but it was really something that stood out to me. She said, when you're making dinner, there needs to be something on the back burner. Like the back burner is just something you got to stir every now and then. And on the front burner is the thing you really need to be attentive to. And she's like, as long as we just make sure that we kind of give ourselves a stir every now and then, we're going to be okay. And I just was like, no, that is not okay. You are so valuable as a human being. You're not going to make it if you give yourself self-care just every now and then when you have a chance. Because you guys know when you have 20 minutes to yourself, you're going to stare at the wall and you're going to think of all the laundry and everything else that needs to get done. And then you're not going to take care of yourself. And so turning the lights on in the relationship means that you go to your spouse and you say, I am exhausted. I really need your help. And when you do fill in the blank, it feeds me. It makes me feel like I can replenish when I can go for a walk and you take the kids for 30 minutes. Like give them an actual something that they can win at. Give them an example of exactly what's going to feed your soul. Communicate that and say, if you can just give me 30 minutes with the kids so I can just go outside and go for a walk and hear nothing but the wind and the birds and not children, then I think it'll help me decompress a little bit. And when you help me with the dishes, I just take a deep breath and I'm just so grateful. And it does so much for me. Like you've got to be able to express that, give them a chance to win, because here's the thing, everybody wants to win. Nobody wants to lose. Your spouse is not trying to lose, and they're not trying to be malicious, and they're not trying to hurt you. We just have to speak out loud the things that are in our heart and not be passive about it. But we have to do it in kindness. If you don't, you're just doing it aggressively. We're just swinging the pendulum to the other side. Okay.
What ends up happening usually is that both spouses begin to feel and spiral in their own little areas of hurt for too long, and they end up kind of hiding in their own little holes. And if they're not assertively communicating with where they're at and what's going on with them, and they're really hoping the other person guesses, or that they feel like they've been so isolated and felt like they haven't been understood for so long, that's where that rift begins to grow and people begin to grow apart. And so the assertive communication is really making that leap across that canyon to come to the other side and say, okay, this is where I'm at. This is what's going on with me. This is what I need. And when you do, just like Corie said, when you do X in situation Y, I feel Z. So it's an empowering thing. And we're all, let's be honest, I mean, between the supporting spouse and the serving spouse, or if you're dual military, both serving spouses, we're all exhausted, y'all. Yeah. That's what being an adult is. Being adult is basically just being it is being exhausted until you fall asleep while you're holding the grandkids. That's adult, all right? That's where we're all going. It's just
we're all headed.
We're all headed there, okay?
And then we're gonna get in trouble for that.
And then people are going to look at it and go, can you believe they fell asleep? Yeah, because you exhausted them, kids. You just wore them slap out.
You did this to me.
You did this to me, and naps are happening. All right. So
I love it. The next comment is actually coming off of the other one. I think this is really important for us to touch on.
Right.
Somebody responded off of that last scenario. They were responding that it can be really tough when you hold your spouse accountable and you ask them to change something, and then they get an attitude or they get defensive because you've held them accountable on something. And I just want to go back to what we started in the beginning. Assertiveness is, again, being able to communicate your own thoughts, feelings, and opinions, and asking for change in a kind way that's not aggressive, right? But it's owning your own and managing yourself. If the other person doesn't respond to your healthy assertiveness, if they respond in defensiveness, aggressiveness, or passive aggressive in this case, that's not necessarily, I want to be careful on how I say this. I'm trying to say it's not necessarily your fault, although the best we can do is own our intentions of what we're trying to do in healthy communication. But that doesn't mean there's gonna be times that you're gonna try to be assertive and be healthy, and it's still not gonna quite be there, right? So there's room for feedback on that, but there is an element of do the best you can to communicate as healthy as you can, be willing to grow from it if you get it wrong, be willing to get some feedback, but at the same time, if they don't respond in a healthy way, for me, and then Matt, I'll let you respond. For me, that's the next level of conversation that needs to happen, right? It kind of goes up a level. Like on video games, you go to the next level. Like if I'm communicating, hey, I really would like for you to not play video games tonight. This is not a situation with Matt and I, but I'd really like for you to not play video games tonight and help me with the kids. That would be really helpful. I'm just so tired. And they're like, well, what am I supposed to do? Like, this is the time that I hang out with my friends, and that's just what I do every night, right? If my healthy communication or my attempt at that is not respected, now it's time for the next level of conversation. The next level of turning the lights on in this relationship is now you not being willing to hear what I'm asking from you is now creating emotional destruction and connection destruction in our relationship. And so now I need to communicate that. So when I ask you to help me and you are defensive, or when you don't want to help, this is how this ad impacts me. And it makes me not want to be close to you. Like, I don't want to be close to you because when I ask for help and you're unwilling to give it, I'm hurt by that. So now we've gone up a level in our communication and what we need to be assertive about. Matt, what were you going to say?
So I was going to say, when you use the word accountable, it implies that there have already been rules that two people have agreed on, and that you are holding somebody to the rules to which you have both agreed on. If you haven't set rules for your marriage or for your household, and people are acting in one way or another in a way that you don't like, and you confront the person, even if it's assertive communication, just be aware that that person may get into a defensive posture and feel like it's not accountability, it's accusatory. And so whenever somebody feels accused of something, they'll naturally become defensive. I'm not saying that you're accusing them by using assertive communication. I'm just saying be aware that if you haven't agreed upon what the rules are for the house, then there's really nothing to hold anybody to accountable to. So backing that up, you have to decide, what are the rules? So when you're talking about communication during deployment, going all the way back to the beginning when Corie and I were talking, we didn't have a rule for, okay, major medical scare happens during the deployment. Do you want to know? Do you not want to know? Yes or no? And now we know we should probably have that conversation. And sometimes you stumble upon those realizations even when you weren't planning on it. But it is key. It's crucial to sit and have family business meetings where you're not just talking about, the calendar that's coming up or the finances in the house. Sometimes you have to go, okay, now what are the rules? And usually we figure those out. We start to decide we need to start making rules for the house only when we have kids. And then all of a sudden we're like, oh man, these kids are unruly. They do whatever they want. Well, as adults, we tend to act like kids and teenagers too, because we figure we can set our own rules. So if you don't want to have that blow up or that confrontation, when there's a good setting and a good opportunity, being able to assertively communicate, here are what I want the rules of our house to be, and for you guys to, over time, to develop and agree on those rules, because rules are in place for you to get to a place that you want to go. If you don't have those rules, you're living accidentally. So first off, you got to agree, what do we want our marriage to look like? What are the characteristics of our marriage, of our house? Agree on the nature of your marriage first, and then go, so what rules do we have to put in place in order to get there? Because if we don't have those rules, we'll never get there. It's the same way with going to, yep, go ahead.
And what happens when somebody breaks the rules? That's right. Where people get stuck on that, right? Yep. I did want to circle back because I mentioned Steve's comment. I think it was Steve's comment that was up above where I said it was an example of assertive communication, where he said, actually, Nicole said to Steve, right? So that's the couple, Nicole and Steve, where she said, I'm sorry if I'm getting this wrong, but it's your fault, guys, for logging into the same account. Okay. But she said to him, I love you and I love spending time with you, but I need alone time. Now, what's so healthy about that is you can hear the kindness. You can hear, I'm not running over you. I'm actually saying I love you. And then I love spending time with you. So we're pointing out the positive, we're pointing out the connection in the relationship. It's not saying that not that it has anything to do with you. This is something I'm communicating my own need for rest and alone time. It has nothing to do with us. So she's validating that. And then asking clearly, Franklin Covey calls it straight talk. Like straight to the point, very direct, but kind, like I need alone time. And then his response was, I understand, I'm going to go play golf. And he went for 10 hours, right? Because he knows they've had enough conversations that he knows he's coming back to somebody who's more replenished, right? And so he has the freedom to go play golf. She has the freedom to have that alone time. And it all happened because we communicated with kindness and with straight talk. Go ahead.
So I'll say now, if you're deployed, or you're both, dealing with a deployment, start now the conversation of what life is going to look like during reintegration. Begin to do expectation management, because that little conversation between Nicole and Steve is a perfect example of the kind of conversation that needs to happen weeks prior to reintegration and reunion, where you need to go, I'm excited to see you, but I would like X, Y, and Z. I'm excited to come home. I'm excited to see the kids, but also maybe need to go hunting just to be away from people, because, Corie's at home with kids all the time. And then service members are with other service members all the time. They're not necessarily getting any of that quiet time themselves. So being able to say that and then go, okay, well, let's look at a calendar. Let's figure out how we're going to work on this expectation, on our expectation management, and what life is going to look like when we begin reintegration. That will save a lot of problems for when you both come home and then both want to go do other things that don't seem to work.
Lots of need.
Yep.
So we're going to wrap up because we could honestly do this for hours. And if you know us, you know we can. So it's been a joy to spend some time with you. Here's how I would kind of wrap up and vision cast moving forward for you guys as you leave for today. Number one, part of communication takes boundaries. It takes self-awareness of knowing what you need and being able to own your own feelings and not manage the other person, but it's also being kind and letting them have their own feelings too. It's definitely about boundaries, and boundaries come from what Matt was saying, your shared values and the rules around your relationship, and talking through what happens if somebody breaks the rules. What do we do with each other? How do we communicate that we need somebody to change behavior if somebody kind of broke a rule, right? And we're not talking about like loyalty kind of rules, although sometimes that is the conversation, right? But it can be as simple as, I thought one of the rules that we had for marriage is when you come home from a deployment that you're fully 100% taking care of the kids. I wasn't expecting you to check out, right? Like that kind of was not what I was expecting.
I thought one of the rules of marriage, I would say this, one of the rules of marriage should always be, we don't threaten to leave one another.
Right. That was even some great advice that we got from some mentors very early on when we needed it the most. Yeah. And so we didn't get to cover timeouts, but timeouts are healthy. They are important. And there are rules surrounding timeouts. It is, it's healthy to call it, but it's also healthy to call a time in and get back to talking again. So there's so much more, and I'm going to throw this last one in really quickly because somebody asked about external family members, and our rule of thumb is talk about it as a couple and figure out your feelings on that. But our kind of general rule of thumb is that, your spouse should be managing boundaries with their family and you should be managing yours, unless we're talking about safety issues. So Laura, I'm going to let you come back on. So much that we could cover. We didn't even get to all the questions. We did our best to get to the questions of those that were specifically attending and here in the chat. Thank you for the great conversations, the great questions. It's a really important topic and really a difficult thing to do during deployment. My goal by the time I see you guys again, by the way, the next topic that we're going to cover is a big one. The next topic we're going to cover is how do you recover and restore some of those deeper wounds in your relationship. So if you have dealt with things like betrayal or just hurt, deep hurt, we get questions all the time. How do we restore? I think Matt's talking with Steve. I think that's what's happening right now.
I'm sorry.
If he's smiling as I'm talking through like deep things, that's one of his battle buddies. So We're going to cover some very difficult topics in the next one because we get questions like that all the time. And sometimes betrayals or deep wounds happen during time apart. So make sure you register for the next webinar that will be next month, and we'll be sure to meet you right back here and take your questions as well for that event. So Laura, thank you so much for having us and for giving us the opportunity to serve this community that we love so much. Thank you guys for giving so much of your time.